September 19th, 1944. Dawn breaks over Arracourt, France. Through the morning fog that clings to the Lorraine countryside, Oberführer August von Müller peers through the vision slit of his Panther Ausf A, tank number 3 of the 113th Panzer Brigade. The veteran commander from the Eastern Front studies the misty valley ahead with practiced confidence. His Panther represents the pinnacle of German armoured engineering. 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armour angled at 55 degrees, creating an effective thickness of 140 millimeters. The long-barreled 75mm KWK-42 gun, capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. 45 tons of steel, powered by a 700-horsepower Maybach engine. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What von Müller doesn't know, what none of the German tank crews advancing through that September fog could imagine, is that they are about to encounter a weapon that will systematically dismantle every assumption they hold about armoured warfare. Within hours, these masters of the Eastern Front will discover that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted, that armour means nothing without mobility, and that American ingenuity has created something they never anticipated. The Americans are waiting with their Hellcats, thin-skinned, lightly armed tank destroyers that weigh less than half what a Panther does. German intelligence has dismissed them as death traps, vehicles so poorly armoured that even machine gun fire can penetrate their hulls. But those thin skins hide something the Germans haven't factored into their calculations: speed, manoeuvrability, and 5 Browning machine guns that can tear through engine deck armour like paper. This story is about how German confidence collided with American mobility, how the most feared tank in the Wehrmacht's arsenal discovered its fatal vulnerability, and how 5 50 caliber machine guns rewrote the rules of tank combat in ways no one had predicted. The Panther tank had emerged from the shock of Operation Barbarossa. When German forces invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, they expected to face outdated equipment manned by poorly trained crews. Instead, they encountered the 34, a tank that combined sloped armour, a powerful 76mm gun, and excellent mobility in a package that outclassed every German tank then in service. The KV-1 heavy tank proved even more shocking, virtually impenetrable to anything except the 88mm anti-aircraft gun. German tank crews, accustomed to dominating European battlefields, suddenly found themselves outgunned and out-armoured. Adolf Hitler personally ordered the development of a counter. The result was the Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther, a medium tank that weighed as much as many nations' heavy tanks. First production models rolled off assembly lines in January 1943, rushing into combat at the Battle of Kursk that summer, despite numerous unresolved mechanical issues. By September 1944, most of these teething problems had been resolved. The Panther that German crews took into France represented the most formidable medium tank in the world. Its combination of firepower, armour, protection, and mobility made it a nightmare for Allied tankers. The frontal armour alone told the story of German engineering philosophy. The upper glacis consisted of 80 millimeters of homogeneous steel, but the 55-degree angle increased its effective thickness dramatically. Allied tankers discovered that the 75mm guns of M4 Sherman tanks could not penetrate this armour from any practical combat range. Even the British 17-pounder guns struggled at distances beyond 200 yards. The turret front boasted 100mm of cast steel, also angled to deflect shells. The sides carried 40mm of armour, angled at 40 degrees. Even these relatively thinner sections proved resistant to most Allied anti-tank weapons. But armour was only part of the Panther's superiority. The 75mm KWK-42 gun, with its long L-70 barrel, could penetrate 140mm of armour at 1,000 meters. This weapon outranged and outperformed anything the Americans fielded in their standard tanks. German tank crews knew these statistics intimately. They had survived battles on the Eastern Front, where numerical superiority meant nothing against technical advantage. At the Battle of Arracourt, German units assembled 262 tanks and assault guns. Wikipedia. They anticipated quick victory against what intelligence described as light American forces. Hauptmann Wolfgang Schneider, commanding a company of Panthers from the 111th Panzer Brigade, expressed the prevailing confidence in a letter written September 18th, the night before the battle. His words, preserved in captured German documents, reveal the mindset of men who had never encountered American tank destroyers in their intended role. We face the 4th Armored Division tomorrow. Intelligence reports they have some new American tank destroyers, thin-skinned vehicles called Hellcats. Our Panthers will make short work of them. These Americans do not understand armored warfare. They build fast targets and call them weapons. By tomorrow evening, we will have crushed this minor obstacle and be advancing toward the Moselle. The M18 Hellcat represented a radically different philosophy of armored warfare. While the Germans pursued heavily armored, powerfully armed tanks designed to slug it out in direct combat, American tank destroyer doctrine emphasized mobility, ambush tactics, and rapid response to UTAC armored breakthroughs. Entering production in summer 1943, the M18 first saw combat service in spring 1944. Wikipedia. The vehicle's development had begun in December 1941, immediately after Pearl Harbor, when the Ordnance Department issued requirements for a fast tank destroyer. What emerged from Buick's design studios in Flint, Michigan, was unlike anything else on the battlefield. At 55 miles per hour top speed, the M18 was the fastest tracked armored vehicle of World War II. Wikipedia Amerikange Museum. This speed came from radical design choices that made German observers dismiss the vehicle as fundamentally flawed. The M18's armor was quite light to facilitate its high speed. The lower hull armor was 12.7 mm thick. Wikipedia. The turret boasted only 25 mm of protection on the front. In testing, 9 out of 30 armor-piercing .30 caliber bullets penetrated the side of the turret at a range of 75 yards. Wikipedia. This vulnerability was not an oversight, it was intentional. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce, commanding the Tank Destroyer Force, envisioned units equipped with something faster than a tank, with adequate firepower but minimal armor to maximize speed. He believed that mobility and tactical employment mattered more than armor protection in a weapon designed for ambush and rapid redeployment. The M18 weighed approximately 20 tons. Wikipedia, less than half the Panther's 45 tons. This weight advantage, combined with the Wright Continental R975 engine producing 340 net horsepower, gave the Hellcat a power-to-weight ratio that no German tank could match. The main armament was a 76 mm gun M1A1, the same weapon being introduced on late-model Sherman tanks. Against armor, the weapon could punch through 88 mm at 2,000 meters. Military history of the Upper Great Lakes. This was sufficient to defeat Panzer IVs from the front and Panthers from the side or rear, but wholly inadequate against Panther frontal armor. German tank crews who first encountered Hellcats in Italy and France initially viewed them with something approaching pity. Lieutenant Klaus Bergmann, a Panther commander who survived the war, recalled in a 1978 interview his first sight of an M18. We spotted it moving between hedgerows near Caen in July. My gunner asked permission to engage. I told him to save the ammunition. The thing looked like a toy, barely armored, with an open turret that left the crew exposed. We called them sardine cans, because that's what they would become if we hit them. I remember thinking that American tankers must have done something terrible to be assigned to such death traps. What German crews didn't immediately appreciate was that the Hellcat's weakness was also its strength. The minimal armor meant nothing if the vehicle was never where the enemy expected it to be. The open turret, while exposing crews to artillery and small arms fire, provided excellent visibility for spotting targets and threats. And then there were the machine guns. A 50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun with 800 rounds of ammunition was mounted on the left rear of the turret in a flexible ring mount. Wikipedia. Each crew member carried an One carbine for self-defense. But it was that 50 caliber, often dismissed as secondary armament, that would prove devastatingly effective in ways no one had anticipated. The Battle of Arracourt began as a German counteroffensive. The German 5th Panzer Army had as its objective the recapture of Luneville and the elimination of the 12th Corps bridgehead over the Moselle River. Wikipedia. With local superiority in troops and tanks, German commanders anticipated defeating Combat Command A of the U.S. 4th Armored Division within days. The first German attack, mounted by the 111th Panzer Brigade, fell on the 2nd Mechanized Cavalry Group at Lunéville on September 18, 1944. Wikipedia. The understrength American forces managed to repel this attack, destroying 24 German armored vehicles. But the real test would come the next morning, when Panthers of the 113th Panzer Brigade advanced through fog toward American positions around Arracourt. German tactical doctrine called for massed armor attacks, overwhelming defensive positions through concentrated firepower and armored protection. First Lieutenant Edwin Leiper commanded the 3rd Platoon of C Company, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. His 4 M18 Hellcats represented the only American armored presence in the sector when reports came of German armor advancing through Arracourt. It had started to drizzle, and no one could see anything through the rain and fog. Warfare History Network. Leiper deployed his platoon along the ridgeline, positioning the thin-skinned Hellcats in defilade, using the terrain to hide their hulls while maintaining clear fields of fire across the valley. This was textbook tank destroyer doctrine. Don't slug it out, ambush, shoot, relocate. Through the morning mist, Lieutenant Leiper spotted the muzzle of an enemy tank emerging from the fog. Warfare History Network. Military history of the Upper Great Lakes, then another, and another. An entire company of Panthers, 30 tons heavier than his Hellcats, with armor his 76mm gun could not penetrate from the front. German doctrine assumed that any American armored vehicle would either flee or die when confronting Panthers. What happened instead rewrote both armies' understanding of armored combat. Lieutenant Leiper's battalion knocked out 5 German tanks of the 113th Panzer Brigade within the first 5 minutes of contact, losing only 1 tank destroyer. Military history of the Upper Great Lakes. Wikipedia. The Germans, expecting to overrun weak American positions, instead found themselves taking fire from multiple directions, their Panthers being destroyed by an enemy they couldn't effectively engage. The Hellcats' speed was the key. While Panthers required valuable seconds to traverse their turrets, the nimble American tank destroyers could sprint from one firing position to another in moments. A Panther commander might spot a Hellcat, order his gunner to engage, only to discover the target had already relocated and was now firing at his vulnerable side armor from a completely different direction. But it wasn't just the main gun that was destroying Panthers. Hellcat commanders discovered something that would become legendary among American tank destroyer crews. The Panther's engine deck, covered by only 16mm of horizontal armor plate. Wikipedia, represented a critical vulnerability that 50 caliber machine gun fire could exploit. Sergeant Henry Hartman, commanding one of Leiper's Hellcats, would become the first American to fully exploit this weakness. His tank destroyer, maneuvering at speeds the Panthers couldn't match, circled around the German formation. Sergeant Henry Hartman destroyed 6 German tanks with a single M18 under his control. Wikipedia. Military history of the Upper Great Lakes. Post-battle damage assessment of destroyed Panthers revealed what had happened. Multiple 50 caliber rounds had penetrated the thin engine deck armor, shredding cooling systems, fuel lines, and engine components. The fires that resulted from this damage were catastrophic. German crews abandoned tanks that were technically still capable of fighting, fleeing vehicles that were burning from the inside. Oberführer von Müller's Panther was among those destroyed that morning. His tank, number 433, was found abandoned with its engine compartment gutted by fire. Forensic examination revealed over 30 50 caliber impacts on the engine deck, several of which had penetrated completely. The crew had escaped, but von Müller was captured 2 days later, wounded and suffering from severe burns. His interrogation, preserved in U.S. Army records, provides insight into the psychological impact of the Hellcats' success. "We never saw them coming," he stated. "One moment, our formation was advancing in good order. The next, Panthers were burning all around us. The American vehicles appeared and disappeared like ghosts. We tried to engage, but they were too fast, too small, too unpredictable. Then came the sound. "What sound?" his interrogator asked. "The machine guns. Heavy caliber. We heard them firing, heard the impacts on our armor. We didn't think they could hurt us. Panthers are invincible from the front, but they weren't shooting at our fronts. They were above us, shooting down at our engines. The first indication we had of real danger was when smoke started coming through the driver's compartment, then fire, then nothing but chaos. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The fog that had concealed the initial German advance became their enemy as the morning of September 19th wore on. Throughout the rest of the morning and into the early afternoon, panzers emerged from the woodline bordering the village of Moncourt to probe for Americans in the valley. Each time, the Hellcats would make them pay for their curiosity warfare history network. The tactical dynamics were unlike anything German tankers had experienced on the Eastern Front. Soviet tank tactics emphasized mass attacks, overwhelming German positions through numerical superiority. Soviet 34 crews rarely employed sophisticated maneuver warfare, instead relying on their tanks' excellent armor and firepower in direct assaults. American tank destroyer doctrine was entirely different. The Hellcats didn't defend fixed positions. They created killing zones, areas where German armor would be channeled into carefully prepared ambushes. The terrain around Arracourt, with its rolling hills and wooded areas, proved perfect for this approach. Corporal Dominic Sorrentino, serving as gunner in Sergeant Edwin McGurk's Hellcat, knocked out 2 more panzers with shots to their rear warfare history network. The pattern repeated throughout the morning. Panthers would advance, confident in their superiority. Hellcats would appear from unexpected angles, engage the vulnerable flanks or rear, then vanish before German return fire could be effective. The disparity in mobility proved decisive. A Panther could reach 35 miles per hour on roads under ideal conditions, but cross-country performance was significantly worse. The heavy vehicle's ground pressure and complex suspension meant it struggled in soft terrain. Sharp turns at speed risked throwing tracks or damaging the delicate final drive units that had plagued Panthers since their introduction. The M18 could reach speeds approaching 55 miles per hour, Wikipedia. But more importantly, it could accelerate, decelerate, and change direction with agility no 45-ton tank could match. This difference meant that Hellcat crews could dictate the terms of engagement. If a Panther appeared in an unfavorable position, the Hellcat simply left. If a Panther exposed its flanks while maneuvering, the Hellcat pounced. German radio intercepts from September 19th, captured and translated by American intelligence, reveal the growing panic in panzer formations. At 10:15 that morning, a company commander from the 113th Panzer Brigade transmitted, "Taking fire from multiple directions, cannot identify enemy positions, request immediate support." By 11:30, the transmissions became more desperate. "Have lost visual contact with 3rd Platoon, seeing vehicles burning to our left. American tank destroyers are everywhere and nowhere. They appear, fire, and disappear before we can respond." At 1300 hours, more than half my company destroyed or disabled. These are not the tactics we trained for. The Americans refuse to fight properly. They run like cowards, but my Panthers burn. Request permission to withdraw and regroup. That last transmission was never answered. The company commander's Panther was destroyed minutes later, hit in the side by a 76mm round while attempting to pursue a Hellcat that had just destroyed his platoon leader's tank. By the time the battle ended, Leiper's platoon had destroyed at least 14 Panzers Wikipedia Warfare History Network. The broader engagement around Arracourt proved even more devastating for German forces. In September 1944, tank destroyer units encountered a number of Panzer battle groups in combat. At the end of these encounters, the M18s were credited with destroying 39 Panzers, while losing only 4 M18s Wikipedia. This nearly 10-to-1 kill ratio against the Wehrmacht's most feared tank represented a complete reversal of expectations. German intelligence had predicted that each Panther could destroy multiple American armored vehicles before being knocked out. Instead, the reverse proved true. The psychological impact on German tank crews was immediate and profound. Unteroffizier Hans Weber, a loader in a Panther that survived the battle by retreating after witnessing his entire platoon destroyed, provided testimony during interrogation that illustrated the mental shift occurring in German ranks. "We entered France believing our Panthers were invincible," Weber stated. "We had destroyed 34s by the dozens in Russia. We knew about the American Sherman, laughed at it. 75mm gun, thin armor, tall profile, easy targets. When intelligence briefed us on the Hellcat, we laughed, harder. Paper armor, open turret, crews exposed to the elements, suicide vehicles, we called them. But at Arracourt, we learned fear. These Americans didn't fight the way we expected. They didn't come at us directly. They waited. They watched. Then, they struck like vipers, always at our weakest points. Our commanders kept ordering us to engage, to destroy these inferior vehicles. But how do you engage what you cannot catch? How do you destroy what won't stand and fight? And those machine guns, we heard them constantly, the heavy drumming sound. At first, we ignored them. Machine guns against tank armor? Ridiculous. But then Panthers started burning, engines failing, crews bailing out of vehicles that should have been undamaged. We didn't understand until we saw the wrecks after the battle. The Americans were shooting at our engine decks, the one place our armor was thin. They found our weakness and exploited it with weapons we never considered threatening. The 50 caliber. Browning M2 machine gun had been designed as an anti-aircraft and anti-personnel weapon. Its half-inch diameter projectiles could penetrate light armor, but conventional wisdom held that it was ineffective against tanks. The Hellcat mounted only one, primarily intended for defense against aircraft and infantry. What Hellcat crews discovered at Arracourt was that the weapon's capabilities depended entirely on where you aimed it. Against a Panther's frontal armor, 80mm of sloped steel, 50 caliber rounds were useless. Against the side armor's 40mm, they might cause spalling or damage external equipment, but couldn't penetrate. But against the 16mm engine deck, especially when firing from elevated positions or during flanking maneuvers, they were devastating. The M2 fired at a rate of 450 to 550 rounds per minute, with 800 rounds typically carried on each Hellcat. A sustained burst of just 5 seconds could put 40 to 50 projectiles into a target area. When that target was a Panther's engine compartment, the results were catastrophic. The Maybach HL-230 engine that powered the Panther was a technological marvel, a V12 producing 700 horsepower. But it was also complex, with multiple vulnerable systems. Cooling lines carried water throughout the engine, fuel lines fed the carburetor, electrical systems controlled ignition. All of these systems lay beneath 16mm of horizontal armor plate. 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds could penetrate this thickness at ranges up to 1,000 yards when striking at perpendicular angles. When Hellcats maneuvered to positions where they could fire down at engine decks, even at oblique angles, multiple penetrations were virtually guaranteed. Once inside the engine compartment, each penetrating round created chaos. Ruptured cooling lines sprayed water onto hot engine components, creating steam and potentially cracking cylinder heads. Severed fuel lines sprayed gasoline onto surfaces hot enough to ignite it. Electrical damage could cause shorts, fires, or complete engine failure. German crews discovered that even non-penetrating hits created problems. The shock of multiple 50 caliber impacts could crack welds, loosen connections, and damage sensitive components. Panthers that escaped seemingly undamaged from Hellcat attacks often broke down hours later as vibration-damaged parts failed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The battle at Arracourt continued for 11 days, from September 18th through September 29th, 1944, Wikipedia. German units had assembled 262 tanks and assault guns for the offensive. Wikipedia. By the time fighting ended, German losses were catastrophic. The 704th Tank Destroyer, battalion, primarily equipped with M18s, became legendary for its performance. Beyond the initial engagement, Hellcat crews continued to demonstrate the effectiveness of mobility over armor throughout the campaign. German attempts to concentrate forces for breakthrough attacks repeatedly failed, as Hellcat platoons appeared on flanks, destroyed lead elements, and disrupted entire formations. Captain William Dwight, serving as liaison officer between Combat Command A and the 37th Tank Battalion, witnessed multiple engagements. His after-action report, preserved in National Archives records, provides detailed tactical analysis of why the Hellcats proved so effective. The German tactical doctrine emphasizes coordinated maneuver by platoon and company-sized elements, Dwight wrote. This requires radio communication, clear fields of view, and predictable enemy responses. The Hellcat negated all three requirements. Our tank destroyers operated independently, taking advantage of local terrain and opportunities. German commanders attempting to coordinate responses found their subordinate units engaged and destroyed before proper formations could be established. Additionally, the Panthers' slow turret traverse proved a critical weakness. While the German tank possessed superior armor and firepower, these advantages meant nothing when Hellcats appeared on flanks or in rear areas. A Panther commander spotting a threat to his left would order traverse, but the electro-hydraulic system required several seconds to rotate the heavy turret. The Hellcat, with its lighter turret and faster traverse mechanism, could acquire and engage targets in a fraction of that time. Most significantly, German crews demonstrated increasing reluctance to advance aggressively. Panthers began moving more cautiously, with more attention to protecting flanks and rear. This defensive posture negated their offensive capability and made them easier targets for our tank destroyers. The psychological transformation, Dwight observed, would become increasingly pronounced as the campaign continued. By late September, captured German tank crews uniformly described fighting Hellcats as uniquely terrifying compared to engaging other Allied armor. Obergefreiter Martin Schulz, a driver in a Panther knocked out on September 25th, explained the terror in his interrogation. Fighting Shermans was dangerous but comprehensible. They would approach, we would engage, the better crew and equipment would prevail. We knew our Panthers were superior. We had confidence. Hellcats were different. They attacked like wolves, always in packs, always from unexpected directions. You couldn't predict where they would appear. You couldn't catch them if they chose to retreat, and you never knew when those cursed machine guns would start tearing at your engine. The worst part was the sound. After Arracourt, every German tanker knew what it meant when you heard that deep, rhythmic hammering. It meant a Hellcat was above you or behind you, putting rounds into your engine deck. It meant you had seconds before fire reached the crew compartment. It meant death was no longer theoretical but immediate. We started calling them ghost cats because they seemed to appear and disappear at will. Morale collapsed. Men who had fought across Russia without flinching became nervous wrecks at the thought of encountering Hellcats. Some crews abandoned perfectly functional Panthers at the first sign of American tank destroyers. The industrial story behind the Hellcats' success provided its own form of psychological warfare. Production of M18 Hellcats ran from July 1943 until October 1944, with 2,507 built. Wikipedia. The Buick plant in Flint, Michigan, had been transformed from automobile production to weapons manufacturing with remarkable speed. With its peak production in January 1944 at 250 M18s being produced per month, military history of the Upper Great Lakes, American industry demonstrated a capacity German planners found incomprehensible. By comparison, Panther production never exceeded 350 tanks per month, and that figure included all German manufacturers combined. More significantly, every destroyed Hellcat could be replaced within weeks. Crews were trained in the United States for months before entering combat, arriving in Europe with hundreds of hours of experience in their vehicles. German tank crews by late 1944 received minimal training, sometimes as little as 2 weeks, before being thrown into combat. The quality difference showed immediately. American Hellcat crews understood their vehicles' capabilities and limitations intimately. They knew exactly how to exploit the M18's speed and agility while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. They practiced shoot and scoot tactics until they became second nature. German Panther crews, by contrast, increasingly consisted of undertrained teenagers, replacing experienced veterans lost on the Eastern Front. These new crews lacked the tactical sophistication to effectively employ their superior vehicles. A Panther in the hands of a veteran crew was a formidable weapon. The same tank, crewed by inexperienced men, became a burning coffin when faced with trained American tank destroyer crews. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion working alongside Hellcat units, observed this qualitative advantage firsthand. In his November 1944 report to Higher Headquarters, he noted, "Enemy tank crews demonstrate decreasing competence with each engagement. Even when German armor possesses tactical advantage, superior American crew training and aggressive employment of tank destroyers consistently achieves favorable outcomes. The psychological impact of Hellcat operations extends beyond immediate tactical effects. German armored formations demonstrate obvious reluctance to advance when tank destroyers are reported in sector. This defensive posture allows our forces to seize and maintain initiative even when facing numerically superior enemy forces." The battles around Arracourt in September were followed by continued operations through autumn 1944 as American forces pressed toward Germany. Hellcat battalions participated in nearly every major engagement, consistently demonstrating the value of mobility and tactical flexibility. The M18 Hellcat was a key element during the Battle of the Bulge. Wikipedia. When German forces launched their desperate counteroffensive in December 1944, Hellcat units played crucial roles in blunting armored spearheads. On December 19th through 20th, Team Desabry, with just 4 M18 tank destroyers of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion to assist, attacked units of the 2nd Panzer Division. Wikipedia. The Ardennes fighting demonstrated that the lessons of Arracourt had been absorbed by Hellcat crews throughout the European theatre. German tank commanders discovered that their Panthers and Tigers could not achieve the breakthrough necessary for success because American tank destroyers denied them freedom of maneuver. By early 1945, the transformation in German attitudes toward the Hellcat was complete. Hauptmann Friedrich Koch, a company commander who had survived from France through the Bulge to Germany's borders, provided revealing testimony after his capture in February 1945. "I commanded Panthers for 18 months, Koch stated. I fought Russians, British, and Americans. Each enemy had different characteristics, different strengths and weaknesses, but only the Americans truly understood how to defeat the Panther. The Russians tried to overwhelm us with numbers. Sometimes it worked, but at terrible cost. The British tried to match us technically with their Fireflies and heavy tanks. This created battles of attrition we often won through superior training. The Americans did something cleverer. They built a vehicle that couldn't defeat us in direct combat, then ensured they never had to fight us directly. The Hellcat represented everything our doctrine said was wrong: thin armor, open turret, modest firepower. By our calculations, it should have been useless. But doctrine doesn't account for speed. It doesn't consider that a tank which can't be caught can't be killed. It doesn't recognize that firepower means nothing if you can't aim it, and armor means nothing if the enemy shoots where you're unprotected. At Arracourt, I lost 11 Panthers in 3 days, not to enemy tanks in honorable combat, but to ghosts that appeared and vanished. Half my crews never saw what killed them. They heard machine guns, thought nothing of it, then died when their engines exploded. The survivors refused to advance. They knew that movement meant exposure, that exposure meant death. By January 1945, my remaining crews were paralyzed by fear. Young men who should have been eager for combat instead begged to be reassigned to infantry. Anything except facing those cursed Hellcats again. The final accounting of Hellcat effectiveness defied German expectations. The Hellcat became legendary by having a higher kill-to-loss ratio than any tank or tank destroyer fielded by U.S. forces in World War II, which officially made it the most effective U.S. tank of the Second World War, War History Online. This achievement was all the more remarkable, given that the vehicle's design had been criticized from the start. The Army's Tank Destroyer Center shipped trial models to the 894 Battalion at the Anzio beachhead. After inspecting the new tank destroyers, the 894 Battalion decided not to deploy them for fear that their weak armor would make them too vulnerable in head-to-head combat with German armored vehicles. Warfare History Network. Those initial concerns weren't entirely wrong. The Hellcats' thin armor meant that any penetrating hit was likely catastrophic, but the vehicle's design philosophy accepted this limitation, compensating through mobility that made hits far less likely. German gunners couldn't hit what they couldn't track. The irony wasn't lost on German veterans in post-war years. At a 1983 reunion of former adversaries in West Germany, Oberst Ludwig Bauer, who had commanded a Panther battalion destroyed at Arracourt, reflected on the experience. "We entered that battle laughing at the Americans," Bauer recalled. "Our intelligence showed us photographs of the Hellcat. We saw the thin armor, the open turret, the small gun. We saw weakness. We saw targets. We saw confirmation of our superiority. What we didn't see was our own weakness. We were so confident in our Panther's frontal armor that we forgot about the rest of the vehicle. We built a fortress that could only face one direction. The Americans built a rapier that struck from every direction. The American .50 caliber machine gun was nothing special. We had similar weapons, but we never thought to aim them at engine decks. We never trained for the kind of mobile, flanking combat the Americans mastered. We believed armor and firepower would prevail. We were wrong. Arracourt taught me that in war, the better weapon doesn't always win. The weapon employed better wins. The Americans understood this. They built a tank destroyer that couldn't beat us in the fight we wanted, so they fought a different fight entirely, and we burned." The technical analysis conducted by both armies after the war confirmed what combat had demonstrated. The M18's combination of speed, firepower adequate for flank and rear attacks, and minimal armor that kept weight low had created something unique. It couldn't stand in line of battle, like a traditional tank, but it didn't have to. It defined its own battlefield, fought on its own terms, and won decisively. German post-war assessments acknowledged the strategic failure of overemphasizing armor protection. The Panther's 80mm frontal armor had been overkill against most Allied weapons, adding weight and complexity that reduced mobility and reliability. Had those resources been devoted to side and rear protection or to improving engine deck armor, the vehicle might have been more effective overall. But German doctrine had been shaped by Eastern Front experiences, where tank battles often occurred at ranges where frontal armor was critical. The Wehrmacht never adapted quickly enough to American mobility-focused tactics. By the time German designers recognized the need for better all-around protection, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to redesign and produce improved vehicles. The Hellcat's legacy extended beyond World War II. After World War II, the Hellcat saw limited action in Korea War History Online and served with various armies for decades. But its real impact was doctrinal. It proved that mobility could substitute for armor, that speed was a form of protection, and that unconventional employment of conventional weapons could achieve extraordinary results. For American armor doctrine, the Hellcat validated the concept of specialized vehicles, optimized for specific roles. The vehicle couldn't do everything, but what it could do, it did superbly. This philosophy would influence American armored vehicle development throughout the Cold War and beyond. For German survivors, the Hellcat remained a symbol of how tactical and technical superiority could be overcome by operational excellence and industrial might. In memoirs and interviews, German veterans consistently identified encounters with Hellcats as moments when they recognized the war was lost. Not because of any single defeat, but because the vehicle represented everything they couldn't match: rapid production, well-trained crews, and tactical flexibility. The transformation from mockery to fear had taken less than 6 months. German tankers who laughed at intelligence photos in spring 1944 were by autumn begging to avoid sectors where Hellcats operated. The thin-skinned, suicide vehicle had become the most feared tank destroyer on the Western Front. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The numbers told part of the story. Of the 262 tanks and assault guns deployed by German units in the week of fighting near Arracourt, Wikipedia, more than half were destroyed or abandoned. American losses were minimal by comparison, vindicating the tank destroyer doctrine that so many had doubted. But behind those statistics lay the human reality. Young men on both sides, fighting desperately for causes larger than themselves. German tankers who had believed themselves invincible, discovering mortality in the morning fog of Lorraine. American crews who had been told their vehicles were inadequate, proving through courage and skill that doctrine and training mattered more than armor thickness. The 50 caliber machine guns that shredded Panther engine decks became legendary. In bars and reunions across America, Hellcat veterans would describe that distinctive sound, the heavy hammering that meant another German tank was about to burn. They spoke with pride about their vehicles, about the speed that saved their lives and the tactics that won battles. German survivors spoke more quietly, in smaller gatherings. They remembered the Panthers burning, the crews that didn't escape, the growing realization that their technical superiority meant nothing against an enemy who refused to fight on German terms. They remembered the fear that came with each mission, knowing that the ghost cats were out there, somewhere, waiting to strike from directions impossible to predict or defend. In the end, the story of the Hellcat and the Panther wasn't just about tanks. It was about hubris meeting reality, about confidence shattered by experience, about the discovery that in war, the side that adapts fastest often prevails regardless of technical advantage. German tankers had mocked the Hellcat based on paper specifications and conventional wisdom. They had laughed at its thin armor and modest firepower. They had dismissed it as evidence of American military incompetence. Then they met it in combat, and the laughter died with their comrades, burning in Panthers that were supposed to be invincible. The sound of 550 caliber machine guns tearing through engine deck armor became the soundtrack of defeat, the mechanical requiem for the Wehrmacht's armored supremacy. The Ghost Cats had taught the Panther crews a lesson they would never forget. In armored warfare, sometimes the best armor is not being there when the enemy shoots, and sometimes a half-inch bullet, properly placed, kills more surely than the most impressive cannon in the world.